The views and opinions on Where Did the Road Go belong to those making them. Do not mistake allowing freedom of speech for agreement. This month's Where Did the Road Go is sponsored by the following amazing individuals: Greg Ross, Billuminati, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, and Michael Frisky. Thank you all for helping to make this show possible. And if you'd like to help out, become a patron at wheredidtheroadgo.com. It's only $3 a month for lots of extra content.
Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? And tonight we're talking to Mr. Joshua Cutchin.
Hey, you didn't do a joke with my last name. That's a first in a while. I feel like the joke has outlived its usefulness, and now I get to be myself again. So I appreciate it.
The joke was I didn't make a joke out of your name.
Right.
Like everyone would expect. I mean, making the joke out of the name was partially because when you first came on, I kept spelling your last name wrong, even though I knew that's not how it was spelled.
Right. Well, I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of people that I know who, like, still have seen my name in print and still add an S or, throw in a letter that's not supposed to be there or something. It's so you're not the only one.
But the thing is, I knew it was Cutchin, and then I'd put the show up and write Crutchin, and you'd be like, you put an R in it. I'm like, damn it, I put an R in it. So that was kind of why I joke about your name, is because I kept screwing it up.
Yeah, and now by, like, spotlighting it, you're never going to screw it up again.
And now it's just tradition. I have to screw up your name.
It is tradition.
My favorite tuba player, Joshua Cutchin.
I'm your only tuba player.
Look, that's not the point.
All right, fair enough. I'll take it.
I might know another tuba player and not know it.
That's true. There are a lot of people who played tuba in high school and such. So, yeah, I'll give that to you. So, it's like that joke from Arrested Development. There are dozens of us. Dozens.
Oh, I honestly, when I heard you do some of the stuff you can do with the tuba, I was blown away. I didn't know tubas could do things you could do with them.
Yeah, and that's where my heart still is in a lot of ways. Like, I just said this to someone the other day. It's like I enjoy the UFO stuff and I enjoy, the paranormal stuff. But if somebody came along with an opportunity tomorrow that was like, paying the bills and that was just doing music full time, I'd be like, yeah, let's do it. It's still where my heart is.
Yeah, but you'd miss the weird stuff.
Yeah, I would miss the weird stuff, and I would, the grass is always greener, right? So, actually, it's kind of funny that I said that, because being now in the thick of Mardi Gras season, it's kind of like, Uncle, I want to go back to the UFO stuff. Can I get a break from the tuba stuff? But it's nice, again, I was saying this, to you earlier, it's nice to have, like, two very different parts of my life where I can sort of disengage from one and use, I think, there's some overlap, but a significantly different part of my brain. In between the two, it really is refreshing.
So we're going to talk about a book you just put out like 2 years ago, Ecology of Souls. Well,
it is technically my my latest nonfiction release, so that's appropriate. That's fine.
Not by much.
Not by much. I was I'm doing this sort of countdown with chapters to the trailer and cover reveal of my next nonfiction book. But for those loyal listeners who are listening to Where Did the Road Go, I'll go ahead and say the release date for Fourth Wall Phantoms is April 13th. So mark your calendars. Yes, it's a Sunday. It's kind of odd, but astrology. So that's why I picked that date.
Okay.
So yeah, that's a little Easter egg inside info for people who are loyal Where Did the Road Go listeners.
Nice. And you've been. What was the first year you were on this show? Was it like 2014?
It would have had to have been 2015.
Okay.
Because it did 2 shows before A Trojan Feast was out. Those were The Graylian Report and Mysterious Universe. Somehow I got on there with just like having a manuscript, which I feel like is kind of unheard of nowadays.
Yeah.
But those were 2 shows that I was listening to in heavy rotation back then, and then those, Micah is the person who put me in touch with Patrick Weege at Anomalous Books, and then it was that was the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning or something. But yeah. So that was sort of what kicked me off, and then I think I reached out to you about talking about A Trojan Feast, and then it became sort of a regular thing, and you're stuck with me like a bad penny.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I heard you on the Graylian Report. I'm like, I need this guy on my show. He's awesome.
Well, and this is and forever shall be my podcast home. I don't come around as often. Like, I've moved out of the basement finally. But I'll always come back and visit, and
And now you're a shining star.
Well, I try to make it a point to call up and be like, hey, can I visit home? For a little bit. It's coming up soon, so yeah.
So, yes, Ecology of Souls, your 2-volume set of books, and these came out when?
They came out in July of 2022, and it's been kind of a whirlwind journey. It's gotten it might have the most attention of any of my books for whatever reason. I think maybe the timing was right, but it's also gotten a lot of different attention. And I'm going to be a little bit coy, but I know that Ecology has been read by some very interesting people in some very interesting circles, and it has afforded me some opportunities that I never thought I would have. So I'm very grateful for that. And it's probably, I don't mean to sell myself short or be so presumptive about the quality of Ecology of Souls, but like I could definitely imagine that it's probably the height of everything of anything that I'll do, and part of that's because it's such a massive topic.
It is,
and
it's you have it densely packed in there too.
Yeah, it's every now and then you come across these topics and you're like, why hasn't someone written a book on this? And you get into it and you're like, oh, this is why, because it just goes out in so many different directions. And yeah, I think the end count was 260,000 words. To give people some perspective, my first book, A Trojan Feast, was 60,000 words. I don't think that longer is better. I don't think it's necessarily a virtue, but when you're covering something as pervasive as death in the paranormal, you're going to have to just stretch your arms a bit. And it ended up being, depending on how you count, 2 or 3 volumes, volume 1, volume 2, and then a book that is just reference material. So 3 appendices, bibliography, and endnotes. And those are also available on my website, because I feel like if you buy the book, like, you should have access to the endnotes and the reference material as well.
That's cool.
But anyway, just for the sake of like not breaking the printing presses at Amazon, because you do reach a certain point and the binding starts to fail and whatnot. So that was strictly a logistical decision. And luckily there's a precedent for older folklore books and things like that to have a separate volume that is just the bibliography. So that's what we ended up doing. And man, a lot of logistical concerns came out of that, just in terms of splitting off the endnotes, and like, it seems like a simple thing to do, but it's it definitely added a lot of time to the project in the production phase. So it's the kind of thing where it's like I look back on it and I'm like, how did I do it? And I'm glad I'm not going to do it again.
What do you think was the thing that made you want to write this book?
Well, number one, it was just me finally growing completely tired of the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I mean, I had some wiggle room for being a little bit more sympathetic to it earlier in my career, such as it is. But I just sort of, it was interesting, Soraya. I don't know if you sort of remember this sense that I had, but I came on the scene, quote unquote, in 2015, and there was a nice, interesting push towards altered states of consciousness and discussion of psychedelics and UFOs. And then it was like this course correction with the New York Times article.
Right.
And we were back to talking about propulsion systems and all this sort of stuff that is just, quite frankly, not that interesting to me. And I don't think is really representative of what lies at the heart of the phenomenon. And so that was part of it. Part of it was the fact that this was something that I've been thinking about for about 10 years and sort of collecting little things here and there in my head. Because, and part of it was the fact that I just didn't know what to do with it. And my philosophy, be it religious or political or just in terms of knowing myself, is if I'm uncomfortable with something, I kind of want to pick at it. I kind of want to be like, okay, but what does this mean? Like, it's not going to go away if you ignore it.
Right.
And so this death connection was one of those things. And naturally, it, as my editor and friend of the show, Barbara Fisher, said at one point, it's not really about death. It's about death and birth. That cycle is really what Ecology of Souls is about. And there are these pre-birth memories that people have of, I remember being a ball of light aboard an ET spacecraft. Yeah. What the heck do you do with that?
I know.
Well, because I hear that and like my toes curl, right? It's like, not in a good way. like I'm like, oh, what do I do with this? But it's not going to go away. And these stories are part and parcel of what's happening here. So if you take the assumption that there is some sort of lesson or truth to be learned from those stories that you disagree with and, quite frankly, for lack of a better term, don't like, how can you integrate that into a view that still, plays nice with what you think about things? And so to that extent, there's kind of like a fourth book in Ecology of Souls too. Once you read through it and you get to the afterword in volume 2, it's kind of like there's a fourth book in there that, if you read between the lines, is like me trying to deal with what it means also for my own, faith journey and my own spiritual journey as well.
Yeah. I think the first time this subject really occurred to me is when I read Kenneth Ring's Omega Project.
Yeah, that's a touchstone for all this stuff. So you take that, you take that observation from Ann Strieber that this has something to do with what we call death. You take the similarities of alien abductions to shamanic initiations, and you take this, sort of what I call the power of the transitive property, which is if aliens resemble fairies, which is sort of, a stance that I've had for a long time, no surprise to anyone, and fairies have a close relationship to the dead, escorting the dead, being seen among the dead, like then there is a through line there as well. And again, what the heck do you make of it all?
Yeah, I mean, when I read Kenneth Ring's book, like I got done with it, I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Why are aliens, because at the time, I mean, when that came out, that was like 92, I think, and I think I read it when it came out. I'm like, what do aliens have to do with dying? And that's where I had to kind of step back and go, wait a minute, what if neither of these things are what they seem?
Right, and this might be a good place to sort of engage with a low resolution complaint that I saw, not about Ecology of Souls in particular, but about that connection. And if I had seen it beforehand, it would have made its way into Ecology of Souls, but unfortunately I saw it afterwards. Somebody was like, well, if near-death experiences are related to UFO encounters, then why aren't there more aliens in near-death experiences? And I want to be like, well, number one, there are. Like, people do report seeing grays.
Yep.
But number two, there's this really frustrating insistence in the modern mindset that, extraterrestrials or whatever the UFO occupants are mostly grays. And that's just not the case. Like, if you look at, especially from like a global perspective, but just in general, you're going to find a lot of just people, like human beings aboard these craft. You're also going to find a lot of beings of light. I mean, the free study that Ray Hernandez did suggested that beings of light were more common in these interactions with non-human intelligences that we would refer to as aliens than the grays were, right? Mm-hmm. And both of those things, just, people who who look like people, and beings of light are, absolute staples of near-death experiences.
Yep.
So there's sort of a problem with the way that we've conflated pop culture with the phenomenon itself, and the way that we use that to sort of reinforce our own personal biases. And look, Ecology of Souls, I think that if it doesn't take you into some sort of uncomfortable territory, you might be reading it wrong. I don't know.
Well,
because it's definitely the case with me.
The gray thing, from what I remember, the number of encounters with grays went up after Communion was published, and only in countries where Communion was published. That's not to suggest that people were intentionally lying or anything like that, but that maybe it gave people sort of an unconscious placeholder for what they were experiencing, or they were recalling stuff under hypnosis, and that had become the cultural archetype that hypnosis was creating for these things.
Well, the truth of the matter is that that's sort of a shape and a form that we've been dealing with for a long time. And I've corresponded back and forth with one of my favorite sort of UFO researcher heroes, Martin Kottmeyer, about this. And Martin has made the same point that you're making. The ubiquity of Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Communion sort of reinforce the gray. And I don't disagree with that, but you also can look back all the way to petroglyphs and see things that resemble grays. So there's something about that formation that has sort of been lurking about the fringes of our collective unconscious or something. And that's quite frankly the topic of my upcoming book on April 13th, Fourth Wall Phantoms, is that interplay between culture and media and expectation, and how that seems to have a great deal of bearing on not only UFOs, which has been talked about by Martin and Bertrand Mayust and some other folks, but also I would argue on parapsychology and cryptozoology as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And trying to get my head around the whole near-death thing. The thing is, we don't know anyone who okay. If you have a near-death experience, we don't know that's what happens when you die.
Right. We know that it's something that happens to some people, sometimes possibly as low as 10%, I think. Some researchers have suggested it happens to some people who come back. That's what we know for sure.
Right.
Or at least that they report consistent experiences, I heard one time it said that, and this would be sort of a very Eric Wargo interpretation, is that it's people are getting outside information from the Akashic field on the cusp of death, and maybe they're pre-membering their discussion of their near-death experience after the fact, and that's what
Yeah.
That sort of it's a little bit too Baroque for me. It's a little bit too complicated, but there's an argument to be made there. All we know is that there is a relatively consistent set of experiences that happen and cut across cultures, and cut across time, and do seem to be prefigured in a lot of ancient religious traditions.
Good job, Brain. Where were you going with that? There was
I believe in you, Brain.
I don't think you should. My brain's been through a lot in the last week. It was something about death and near death, and the fact that also, okay, so not only do people have similar experiences, this is what it was, but they have that out of body state where they can talk about what's going on in the room when they're dead, and from a viewpoint that they can't have, basically. When I was looking into this stuff, which is what ended up getting me into the Seth material. One of the things was this heart doctor who was like, oh yeah, I don't believe in near-death experiences. So he gave the same questionnaire to everyone that he operated on for like a year, and found out that, because he would say, well, what do you think was going on, while we were operating on you? And the people who didn't have near-death experiences weren't even remotely close. They would use, kind of like TV show sort of descriptions of the operation and stuff. But the people who had near-death experiences and were outside their body looking at it would be 100% right. And he was just like, I can't ignore this. He's like, There's no way they could know this information unless they were exactly where they said they were.
So you've got a cohort that is describing what happened to a degree of accuracy that exceeds guesswork. And you also have people who are not only surpassing that expectation, but are doing so with a complete flat line of brain activity, which by all we know should preclude hearing or seeing things. Sometimes there are things like blindfolds that are literally over the patient's eyes, even though, so you've got that are not only clinically dead for a certain amount of time, but even if they were awake and alive, they would not be able to see some things. And the famous example of the person who saw a shoe outside on the ledge of the hospital, and I've heard stories like that be challenged to a certain degree and of varying degrees of being convincing, but every time one of those falls, another one comes up to take its place. Like there are plenty of stories like that with that sort of veridical confirmation. And that was that was the trickiest thing about this book, is because it's already long enough. Damn it. I'm not going to try to go in and make a case for near-death experiences. I'm not going to go in and try to make a case for the survival or what the afterlife is, because it's just, go take a religion 101 course or something. That's not where you can go. The real thing that I tried to drill down into are all these other contact modalities, and how time and time again you keep on coming back to death being this like linchpin or this hub around which all these different experiencers orbit.
And one of the explanations too for near-death experiences is it's a endogenous DMT release. And we know some of this stuff shows up in DMT experiences, but it doesn't seem like that really makes a whole lot of sense when you really take it apart.
Yeah, it's a bit like someone saying, you didn't enter that room, you were just given a key. Yeah. It's like, okay, yeah, but the key let me into the room. Like there's a room there, that's sort of the way that I feel about that argument. But again, it's another one of those things where it's like, it's just another aspect that we've all intuited has something to do with the paranormal, that is also perhaps an important part of the death experience and might be the catalyst for which, near-death experiences unfold. I believe it was Rick Strassman who said that he felt that, DMT was perhaps the aegis by which the near-death experience was allowed to unfold.
Yeah, I think so.
And I couldn't agree more.
And brain blanks on his name. The religion professor, Kreipel. Is he not a professor of religion?
He is. I'm just being quiet.
just making sure, like you weren't like, no, you idiot.
No,
he's not.
No. That's been one of the most beautiful things to come out of this, is that I consider Jeff a friend now. He was kind enough to blurb this book. He's also blurbing Fourth Wall Phantoms, because, as I told him, it's the Jeffiest book that's ever been Jeffed by someone not named Jeff. But he's been a real cheerleader for this book.
He had said at a certain point, I think it was just in an interview, that the paranormal happens in someone's life for a reason. Like, he was talking about why it's hard to replicate in laboratories, right? And it seems like near-death experiences change people. UFO encounters change people. Even cryptid encounters change people. There's an aspect there.
Well, and if they don't, you're probably doing it wrong, right? I mean, which, I've speculated, there's that old, I can't remember. I said it was Timothy Leary and someone corrected me and I can't remember who it was. So I'm sure someone in the comments will check me on this, but once you get the message, hang up the phone. Like that was something that's been said about the psychedelic experience. Like, don't keep on going back. Like, once you get the message, hang up the phone. And I think that goes two ways. I think once your message is delivered, hang up the phone. So like, not only do I hang up after getting a call, but after I've made a call and the other person has heard what I've said, I hang up the phone. And I'm thinking sometimes that might be why I seem to be paranormal kryptonite, is because maybe I've gotten the message. I don't know. And there's no need to reach out to me again. But yeah, these aspects are transformational. I would argue that in some respects, that might be the entire purpose for them, or that might be one of their defining characteristics. I mean, because as we discussed, we had a little chat before we started recording. There was a time when our ancestors, and indeed, plenty of indigenous communities around the world today, would hear, a fox crying in the middle of the night. And, to the modern mind, we're like, oh, it was just a fox. But
Right.
like to a lot of minds from these cultures with a longer time depth, they'd say, oh, it is a fox and it's something that has spiritual significance.
Right. Right.
We can live with sort of a both and interpretation of these things.
Well, I mean, that was the giant black dog at the crossroads that made me aware of Hecate. It was a real dog. I, eventually saw the dog chained up at a building at that crossroads, and I'm like, it's the dog. But it didn't in any way remove the profoundness of that dog barking at my window just as I hit the crossroads. And I didn't see him come to the car or leave. And I was like, what the hell was that? And what is it about black dogs at a crossroads that's suddenly so important?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's a great example of that. And, I think that's a richer way of living, honestly. And I think that, a lot of us, myself included, wind up in life in some pretty unpleasant places. And if you look back, sometimes like all the hints were there, like the universe, God, whatever you want to say it was trying to tell you, was trying to speak in this sort of symbolic way. It's just that we've been entrained to think of it in this physicalist, reductionist, materialist sort of way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is it. It's reductionist. It's that didn't mean anything. It was just a dog. It wasn't anything paranormal. It's like, but the dog there at just the right time after I felt like I needed to go down that road, and it makes me think of this thing that then explains these massive synchronicities that I couldn't figure out. It's like, yeah, that's in a sense paranormal without any paranormal elements.
Yeah, I mean that's something I'm advocating for a lot and lately, and I advocate for in the new book is like you've got these stories that kind of make you cringe a little bit about a butterfly landing on someone's shoulder and then being like, oh, that was my mother who passed away.
Right.
And like I'm pretty sure I could put a pin in it if I wanted to, but I think that there's a both and interpretation that, if not literally true, which is what I tend to lean towards, it at least it's true in a way that makes life better.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really good way of putting it. It gives it meaning, even if it's not literally true.
Yeah, it's re-enchanting in that sense. And I know Tim Renner would be like, "Oh, the world's already enchanted." And I'm like, "I know, Tim, but like, I'm saying like we've been conditioned to think that it's not enchanted." Yeah, and little moments like that can sort of help bring that enchantment back into your life.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the fox because the one EVP I've ever gotten was because of a fox. Because I was just recording insect noises for background for anything I might want to use, because the insect noises out here during the summer are insane.
Right.
And I'm standing by my barn and I stop recording and I walk around the corner and I start recording and something screams. And that startled me. I mean, I was in pitch darkness, and
it's a chilling thing to hear.
Like, it is, and
it really is.
A second later, I went, "Oh, that was a fox." All right, and I didn't really think much of it until one of the guys who did the Metallic Onslaught, when I was telling them the story about the fox screaming, is like, "Did you go back and listen to it?" And I'm like, "No." And they're like, "Well, you should go back and listen to it." And I'm like, "I should go back and listen to it." And then I couldn't find it. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure it was this file, but it's not there. And I went to the one before it and I cranked it up, and there's this EVP of this mumbling sound that is very distinct and kind of creepy. And then I'm like, what the hell was that? And then I found the fox scream and realized I couldn't really hear it because I must have bumped the mic while I was walking when it screamed. So not only did that fox scream made me find the EVP, but a certain level of circumstances had to happen for me to find it.
Soraya, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, you were breaking up real bad there towards the end.
Okay, well.
But now you sound fine again, so anyway.
All right, well, what I was saying is that a certain level of circumstances had to happen for me to find that EVP.
Yes. Yeah, and then you start like peeling back the layer, and this is why I really resonate with the Jungian stuff is like once you start peeling back the layers of symbolism on foxes and on all these things that play into that one moment, it can add up to something that is greater than the sum of its parts, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure that was a real fox because I have them on the property. We've had babies under the scary barn before. So I mean, the fact that a fox screamed at me in the dark is not unusual. It's the timing of all that to then get me to hear this EVP that I never would have heard otherwise. Now, what that meant, I have no idea.
Yeah, and once you take this expansive approach, a more holistic approach to how these things that we take for granted can add up into something genuinely uncanny, I guess is a better word than supernatural or paranormal. It puts you in the mindset that yes, anomalous experiences happen every dadgum day,
True. One of the things you mentioned in the book, and it's been a while since I started reading, and my tablet just turned off before I read it. There we go. It's been a while since I started the book, so...
Well, it's been a while since I wrote it, so...
Yeah, well,
I'll see if I remember what you're talking about.
I wrote down that knowledge of a near-death experience makes you less likely to have one.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who said that. But I think I mentioned that at some point in the book.
Well, you must have. I wrote it down. I unfortunately did not quote it, so I don't know where in the book it was. I just made a note.
Yeah, and I wish I had the recall of that, but it sounds like maybe something that Long or maybe Gregory Shushan might have said. And yeah, that's something that seems to preclude the idea that these are, for as much as I love co-creation hypothesis, it seems to preclude the idea that we're just drawing upon things that we expect, at the end of life. And to that point, I as I'm saying this, I'm thinking it probably was Gregory Shushan because he also mentioned how, lights are not necessarily something you would expect from, if memory serves, I'm just flying off the cuff here. Lights are not necessarily something that you would expect in Hopi near-death experiences, given their cosmology, but they are something that Zuni, but they are something that does get reported in those contexts. But it's again, it's a both and sort of thing because he has talked about near-death experiences amongst people from the Church of Latter-day Saints and how sometimes there are the hierarchies that you would associate with the Mormon Church. That you see in some of their near-death experiences that don't appear in other ones. So it's almost like there's a boilerplate of expected imagery that seems to have a tendency. I know it's a lot of weasel words, but that's what you've got to do. There's a boilerplate of imagery and experiences that seem to have a tendency to happen in near-death experiences, but the manner in which they manifest are the things that we bring our cultural expectations to. And part of the reason I use those weasel words is because, things that we accept as near-death experience staples like the tunnel experience or the life review are not are not reported as often as, a lot of us would be led to believe, but they are consistent enough that they do happen. So yeah, it seems to be like, I mean, you could argue the same thing with, something like Bigfoot, right? Like we've been conditioned to expect there to be something tall and human shaped and hairy, but all the details get filled in to a degree that are actually pretty inconsistent if you look at a lot of these reports. Like, given certain parts of the world, you might have flat noses or hooded noses or, human eyes with, a sclera and iris and pupil or all black eyes, So there are variations on a theme, but the theme is there. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. The archetype is there.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, good old Uncle Carl. I sympathize with him more and more.
One of the other notes I wrote down just said souls with wings. And
yeah, that's interesting because, speaking of archetypes, there's a real tendency to label certain things as universal, and you can't really say that any human belief is universal because there's so many variations. But the association of the human soul with birds is pretty darn close, and the association of birds with death is pretty darn close. I would argue that that it's probably an outgrowth of a lot of us before this modern age, the only things that could fly were birds. That has something to do with it. And the number of cultures that conceptualize, the soul as being winged or having, or being like, almost like a literal manifestation of a bird that pops out of your body, is too widespread to ignore. I mean, we're talking about populations from island Southeast Asia and Oceania and Asia and North America and South America and all the, Greece, Rome, Egypt, like the list goes on and on and on. So, you had that concept is in there, which, I would argue might be an origin for winged fairies. Technically winged fairies don't appear until dramas and children's books of, just the past 100 years. But there is sort of a through line. If you look at the Egyptian soul, that there were like 9 of them. So I'm having trouble remembering it. Yeah. I think it's the Ba is the winged one. But was
it 9 or 7?
Well, it depends on the period of Egypt you're talking about, right? Up to 9. And it's been a long time since I've done such a deep dive on ecology of soul, so I'm remembering things as I'm saying it. But Walter Evans Wentz sort of made a comparison to this idea of this one of the small winged Egyptian souls perhaps having a basis for some of these winged fairy beliefs at some point. But the idea of the soul is like a small homunculus that's in there, small souls. Is definitely a part of this concept that I think played into the fairy folklore.
So I quoted some stuff from the book as I was going through. The first thing I quoted, we kind of touched on. To experience an alien abduction or NDE is rare. To have both should be rarer still, yet a 2013 study conducted by Dr. Edgar Mitchell's Free Foundation, over 4,200 respondents from more than 100 countries revealed otherwise. 80% of those experiencing contact with non-human intelligences reported having had an out-of-body experience, while 37% had near-death experiences. The free study categorized any experiences where the witness met non-human intelligences as one of many contact modalities, a term often used because of how well it strips away the surrounding baggage that culture is attached to topics like NDEs, shamanism, altered states of consciousness, UFO cryptid sightings, etc.
Yeah, and this gives rise to a question that I explore a bit more in Volume 2, which is this chicken or the egg question, because you'd think that, people have a UFO experience and then, well, no, actually what you would probably expect would be that people have a near-death experience and they're more likely to see UFOs, right? Because it somehow places you in closer proximity to this other plane of existence. And you look at the literature and it starts to really reinforce that belief until you look at the number of people who have near-death experiences well after their first encounter with a UFO or their first, experience growing up in a haunted house or whatnot. So I really don't know which comes first, other than that the encounter-prone personality also seems capable of, for lack of a better term, manifesting circumstances that will lead to something like a near-death experience, which I think has I don't explicitly say that in either book, but I think that's a pretty profound implication that, you think being an experience-prone personality means that you can see and hear things. You don't think that it actually literally rearranges circumstances in your life to make you have a traumatic NDE. But, I think that the data is at least there partially.
It's an interesting way to look at it. The second quote I had here was, apparently Ring's comparison was already made 2 decades prior by writer and researcher John Keel. In the summer of 1972 Anomaly Journal, Keel compared UFO experiences to death dreams. While this term has since been adopted by parapsychologists to describe death premonitions in dreams, it is obvious Keel was referring to NDEs, and I did not know that when I read this book.
Yeah, and that's the thing. I mean, I keep on coming up with what I think are new ideas, and I go back and it's like, oh yeah, Keel talked about that. Maybe not in the way that you're formulating it, Josh, but and apparently, Kenneth Ring might have done the same if you look back. But it's very apparent he was, I've got the exact quote from Keel here. He says, We have in a death dream, the patient is often in a hospital or involved in a serious accident and is comatose. So he's obviously referring to near-death experiences there.
Right.
He goes on to explain, like, all the things that we associate from near-death experiences within the context of death dreams. And he later goes on to say, we have investigated several UFO experiences which seem based on death dreams. In one of the most recent, the victim was alone aboard a small boat in the fall of 1971. He heard a beeping sound and observed a brilliant blue light overhead. He had a history of heart attacks and was in an alcoholic stupor at the time. His entire experience lasted 12 hours, during which his boat, which was out of gas, moved several miles. Men in black suits appeared on his boat. Others in frogmen garb came out of the water. They wanted him to go with them. Perhaps if he had consented to do so, his dead body would have been found on the boat later. That is not an especially compelling case, I don't think. Like, you can make a lot of excuses. Like, obviously, the current could have moved his boat, and the fact that he was drunk at the time doesn't really help. But the point is that someone was making the connection between UFO encounters and near-death experiences 2 decades prior to Kenneth Ring. And I'm not saying that to belittle Kenneth Ring's work. I think it's great and I think it's important, but it is to say that we often underappreciate what an influence Keel was on this whole topic.
Do we underappreciate it? I think he's pretty well appreciated.
Well, I think we underappreciate. I mean, there's a certain segment, even people whom I like, who have taken issue with the way that Keel played sort of fast and loose with some of his stories.
Right.
The sort of like gonzo journalistic style that he used. And for me, it's all about his ideas and the way that he's getting a point across rather than being a literal retelling of events, And so I grant him some. I'm a bit more charitable than some towards him for that. Yeah,
and there's a lot of argument about how much he actually embellished and how much he didn't.
Yeah, and that's I hate to keep on bringing it up, but it's just where my headspace is right now. That's part of the fourth wall phantoms thing, is that you get to a certain point and you. I don't want to say you don't care about that as much, but you're more engaged with the ideas, you're more engaged with the themes, you're more engaged with these transformative aspects than whether or not this is a literal retelling step by step, bit by bit of these events. And I've been engaging with that side of myself. It leads to some pretty unstable territory. So after my new book is out, I'm going to retreat back to more familiar territory and more stable footing. But I think there is something poetic about engaging with this stuff, at least on a personal level, in that context.
Are you saying you've had experiences because of the book you're writing?
Not quite. I'm just saying that, like, this sort of like, well, obviously this part of it was fabricated, but something genuinely strange did seem to happen. And where do we separate the two? And we need to really get down to like brass tacks and figure out exactly what's going on here with the paranormal. Over the course of writing Fourth Wall Phantoms, that has become less important to me in that context. And again, like, moving forward after this next book, like, I'm going to go back to like trying to figure out like what did happen and what didn't happen. But what I'm alluding to is that there is a middle road where it's like you just sort of maintain absolute agnosticism all the way through it and take some of these bigger lessons from these experiences or writers like Keel.
So that's one of the questions I've been throwing to people recently, is just that. If someone has an experience, and like I can use the Tic Tac video for, the sailors who saw the Tic Tac video then claimed they had weird experiences afterwards. The Tic Tac may very well have been our technology and not something paranormal. That doesn't discount that these people still had weird experiences. And this stuff happens, it seems. Like, people have an experience they think is paranormal, and it seems to open them up, regardless of whether or not the experience was paranormal.
Well, I mean, a perfect parallel to that is the near-death experience that I talk about in Ecology Volume 1. Like, people who are never in any sort of physical danger or physical trauma, but like they believe that their plane is about to go down. They believe that they're about to be in a car accident, and they have all these things that we would associate with a near-death experience. On the one hand, you can say, oh, that means that it's, that it's all, fabrication on our part. But on the other hand, it also pretty handily dismantles some of these more reductionist ideas of the dying brain hypothesis or hypoxia or some of these other things, because, there doesn't, where's the dying brain that's in need of being offered comforting imagery in that scenario? It just isn't there in those near-death experiences. So to that extent, a little bit more directly on what you're talking about with something like perhaps the Tic Tac being terrestrial technology and yet still having these extended consciousness moments or these after effects for people. I think that really is the heart of what, again, I know we're supposed to be talking about Ecology of Souls, but it's the heart of what Fourth Wall Fourth Wall Phantoms is about too. Is about, like, the way that these sort of, because their impression was that it was a UFO, whatever that means, right? Or that it was strange, whatever that means. And what that does is that does open them up to new horizons, and I would argue probably kindles their imagination to access this imaginal realm from which a lot of these things seem to spill.
Imaginal. Where did that term come from? Jung?
Well,
Jung and then Harper?
No, it doesn't begin with Patrick Harper.
No, it begins with Jung, doesn't it?
Not even with Jung. It begins with someone who was whose life overlapped with Jung's a bit. Henri Corbin, who was a French philosopher and studied a lot of. He was actually borrowing the imaginal concept from some Sufi scholars as well, and that he's oftentimes attributed the use of the imaginal, but you can go back even further to sort of parapsychologist Frederick Myers, who was using the term imaginal to describe more or less the nascent qualities within a caterpillar that allow it to one day transform into a butterfly. So he was actually even borrowing that term from, like, etymology. Sorry, entomology, not etymology as words, entomology as insects. But it's this idea that there would be sort of, if you had a caterpillar dissecting another caterpillar, there would be hints and vestigial organs that would point to their, ascension as a butterfly, but the actual idea of the butterfly would somehow be locked in this neither here nor there realm of potential within each caterpillar before they became a butterfly. Yeah, really, really heady concepts. I simplify imaginal primarily as a way to sort of distinguish it from imagination. I say this in Ecology of Souls, where I use the term perhaps a bit too loosely, but the imaginal is from your head, but not in your head, if that makes any sense. Whereas the imagination is confined to both. And I think there's a strong case to be made that something, and who knows what the imaginal is, if it's a real place or anything. The theories of the imagination are extreme. There's a real deficit of those, especially in terms of being internally consistent. I think the imaginal can be a placeholder for a lot of different things, including the paranormal or the supernatural or the afterlife or the other world or Middle Earth or another planet. Like I think it's kind of a catch-all for all those things, and it does speak to just that more than human part of ourselves. And I know that I'm being vague, but that's because the scholarship on it is pretty vague in and of itself. But it is also, that sort of collective unconscious realm of archetypes that we've been dancing around here for a little bit.
You also say real as if we can prove anything's real.
Well, I mean, these are the sort of philosophical waters that you get into. I mean, and not to get too almost solipsistic about it, but, I'm getting a series of stimuli that tell me I'm talking to someone named Soraya up in New York, but I it's all locked within my head, right? And I can't really prove any of that to myself. Right. I can interact with other stimuli in the form of people that agree that you have a podcast and that you exist. I can meet you. I can meet a form of stimuli that claims itself as Soraya, but I can't really, know that in some way. And I realize that, I realize that to a lot of people who aren't as comfortable with the philosophical realms think that this sounds like, us sniffing our own farts, right? But these are the sort of questions that sit at the heart of those disciplines, and I think they're ones that the paranormal community, supernatural community, really should be engaging with on a more regular basis. Yeah,
and I mean, it's sort of a reality tends to be sort of a
suggestion.
Yeah, a suggestion, a consensus, without being as literal as we think it is, because our brain interprets so much. And we just have, cultures have their accepted interpretations that then get taught, and we're not seeing what's there.
Yeah, I don't think reality has laws. I think it has guidelines, tendencies, and strong suggestions. But, I mean, anyone who's sat through a middle school physical science class will remember their teacher telling them, like, there's a possibility that if your atoms align with the atoms of this wall in the exact proper way, you could walk right through this wall.
Right.
So, this is things that science has sort of dressed up in its own veneer of possible, not literally impossible, but I think that the impossible probably happens more often than we give it credit.
That heart doctor I mentioned earlier also noticed that some people who did not die that he was operating on had near-death experiences. Like people that were nowhere near death, they were never in any danger, but they had the near-death experience. They had the out-of-body, the whole thing.
Yeah,
and which was also interesting. And that was one of the things that I was like puzzled by when I found the Seth material. And Seth said, well, when you die, some people leave their body before they're dead, and others stick around long after it's dead. And I went, oh, that kind of explains things, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean that would explain things. It's a bit like when you have somewhere to go and you get your suitcase and you get your keys and you're halfway out the door and then it's canceled.
Yeah, right.
It's like it's the exact same set of things that would have happened if you had gotten in the car and continued along your planned trip. It's just that it got something, forces beyond your control took it away from you.
One of the other quotes I have here says, when Moody revised his list of common NDE elements in 1977, he added several other claims, including supernatural rescues, such as having tumors disappear or physical detached hand that suddenly appears from out of nowhere to pull a person to safety before accidents. In evidence of the afterlife, Long interviewed Anita, whose stage 4 Hodgkin's lymphoma completely disappeared after her NDE, and Geraldine, whose Burkitt lymphoma disappeared after one chemotherapy session on the heels of dying during surgery and met 3 angels. Now, I think there was a woman in France more recently, too, who had stage 4 cancer, died of the cancer, and then had a near-death experience, came back, and was cancer-free.
No, I haven't heard of that, but that's especially interesting.
Yeah, Shirley Black knows her. She's talked to her before.
Okay. Well, I'll have to ask Shirley about that, because that's a whole nother level of compelling. Because we tend to think about NDEs in the context of trauma as opposed to in the context of long-term disease,
right,
and illness, and that's interesting too.
And she had the X-rays, obviously, of all her stage 4. I mean, she died in the hospital. So they had all the cancer on X-ray, and then it was gone. And the doctors were like, "Well, your X-rays must have got mixed up. Maybe you never had cancer in the first place."
Yeah, I mean, it's got to save face, right?
So that always puzzled me, but I didn't realize that Moody had talked about that stuff.
Yeah, he actually expanded his hallmarks of the NDE experience several times, if memory serves, over the course of his scholarship, including things like including things to include negative near-death experiences, these hellish realms.
Yeah.
Cities of glittering light and things like that. So there are, again, it's never that very few NDEs have all of these things, right? But they do have pieces from here and pieces from there.
And that's something Cheryl Lee had told me very early on, is that a lot of the NDE groups do not want to hear about your negative NDE.
It doesn't surprise me.
I mean, it's kind of like UFO groups don't want to hear about your experience that doesn't fit the extraterrestrial sort of, plot line.
But it's so perplexing, because everything about the NDE points to the existence of a spiritual realm, or the validity of metaphysics, and you can only imagine that if world religions are to be believed in their simplest form, like there have to be repercussions for things that you do, or karma that's accrued over the course of lives or something. Yeah, I mean, that's an aspect that doesn't get talked about a lot. The sort of depression and natural outgrowths of that. I know we're on YouTube, so I don't want to say anything that'll get you demonetized, but those sort of after effects that people have difficulty coping with and feeling like they don't belong to this world any longer and wanting to return to that realm of the dead.
Oh yeah.
That doesn't get talked about a lot either. But it's actually quite common, and you can find parallels with that, with the encounter experience too, in terms of UFOs.
Okay. And you also point out that people who have NDEs also tend to blow out electronics, but that's one of those things that you see again across like paranormal experiences. You get poltergeist activity and you get electrical interference.
Well, and the question is, I mean, when ghosts deplete batteries on paranormal investigations, like, is it the ghost or is it the person that's doing it? I mean, this is something that this is something that you really brought me around on. This idea that this is somehow coming from us in some way. I used to really hate that idea, but 10 years of battering you over the head with it on Where Did the Road Go has kind of turned me around on it some. Because I think there is sort of an otherness to these experiences, even if they do come from us. And quite frankly, like where my head is at right now, and this is someplace I kind of arrive at the end of volume 2, is that a lot of these distinctions between the thing and us, I think, are kind of fallacies to begin with. You've got this sort of recurring chorus of monism that you hear across a lot of these experiences, by which I mean this, sort of idea of oneness and that there are no distinctions. That's a thing that you hear all the time in discussions of, experiencers talking about source or going home or, the occupants saying things like that. That's definitely the message of the NDE. And honestly, if there is something to reincarnation, I don't really see many ways that it couldn't be that there aren't these distinctions, because you get these people who say, wait, first of all, let's establish this: the reincarnation research is great. Yeah, it's great. The work of the names are escaping me. I used to have these on the tip of my tongue. The work of look into the PDF, Josh. What does it say in the PDF? The work of Jim Tucker and Ian Stevenson. I knew I'd know that. It's great, right? And I think that reincarnation should be engaged with as a much more serious proposition than folks do. Having said that, I feel a need to sort of reconcile some of the skeptical arguments, which are, well, why do 20 people at any given time all say that they were Cleopatra?
But that's hypnosis based. Okay, go ahead.
Hold on. Why are there more people on Earth than at any other point in history? And it's like, okay, well, the one-to-one thing doesn't seem to work, right? The one-to-one, you die and like your soul is completely contained and you're reincarnated with that same completely contained soul. That doesn't seem to work. And I think something more like the water cycle probably is at play, where you have all these rivers rushing to the sea and then they commingle and evaporate, and molecules that once fell in Papua New Guinea are now falling on Nebraska or something, mixed with other bits of molecules from all across the world. So that does imply that, like, well, it can be other and it can be us and it can be all these things rolled up into one, and there's no real distinction between them. That was a bit of a ramble. I'm sorry, folks.
That's all right. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to take any of the hypnotic stuff at face value. And that's usually where you get the I was Cleopatra, I was, King Arthur, because hypnosis is not, again, a memory recovery tool. It doesn't mean that doing something like Mike Cleland did past life regression with hypnosis and said that he doesn't necessarily believe that those were his past lives, but that helped him deal with stuff in his current life.
Right. I've been playing with this idea that I think Miguel first proposed, but I found an antecedent for it in Patrick Harper too. It's this idea that hypnotic regressions are not remembering what happened. It's a real-time travel into a different space. Yeah. Yeah, there was it might have been Keel. I can't remember the guy's who wrote the books. Oh man, he wrote a lot of stuff about Keel. He knew Keel. He was at Adams conferences. Brent Rains.
Yes, Brent. It was in Brent's book, but I think he quoted it out of one of Keel's books, that they had someone under hypnosis and the person said there's a UFO over the building right now, and got up and walked outside, and the hypnotist followed, and sure enough, there was a UFO hovering above the building.
Greg Little in People of the Web talks about a trio of women who were under hypnotic regression for their abduction and re-manifested the experiences, the symptoms after their abduction. So conjunctivitis, sunburn-like symptoms.
Oh, interesting.
There are some other examples where it became apparent that the questions being asked to the subject were not things that had been asked during their experience, but were being asked in real time with the person on the couch. So, you want to know what the imaginal is? Like, that's the imaginal. That's what I think of as the imaginal. This idea that, mind over matter in the most pop reductive version of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, there are stage magicians who can use hypnosis to show that mind over matter type of thing.
Well, one thing I've been thinking of, and this hasn't made its way into any of my work because it just occurred to me the other day, but what if the reason that people are in a position to undergo hypnotic regression in the first place is because they are susceptible to hypnotic states, and that's what facilitated their initial experience that brought them to the hypnotist's couch. So they are a suggestible person anyway and are more suggestible to these forces, and that's the reason that they seem to have no trouble going under hypnosis again later in that other context.
That's an interesting point.
Yeah. I wish I'd included it somewhere. So feel free to steal that one, folks.
You can use it in the future. You'll have plenty more.
I'll find somewhere to stick it in. Yeah.
All right, we got to take a quick break, but we will be right back with Joshua Cutchin. All right, quick mid-show break here. Some info, contact info, and a recommendation. Everything can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com. And if you have a story you want to share with us for a listener stories show, it's stories at wheredidtheroadgo.com is the place to email those. But links to everything, all our social media, all the shows, everything can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com. If you want to become a patron, it helps us out a lot. And you get extra content with almost every show. You get the shows a week or two early, commercial free. It's a win-win. You get lots of content for only $3 a month. And again, it helps us out greatly. So if you like the show, that is the best way to support it. But you can also support it by leaving us good reviews wherever you're listening to us. I neglect to mention this, but I also I do a music show called The Last Exit for the Lost. It's underground, heavier, darker music. As a metal heart, but there's other stuff in there too. There's punk and hardcore and gothic stuff and, all kinds of dark music, but it's stuff you're not going to hear anywhere else a lot of the time. Mixed with, slightly more common stuff. We stay away from the bigger bands because that's stuff you can get anywhere. I'm trying to expose people to stuff they may have missed, over the years, or new stuff coming along that I think is exceptional. And that's also a weekly show, and it's 6 hours long. So, www.thelastexit.org. If that sounds interesting to you, you can listen to archives of shows going way back. As for a recommendation, I'm going to recommend the movie Presence. It's a low-budget movie, has a few big names in it. It's told from the narrative is from the perspective of a ghost. It's a little bit slow. It's not something that has 2 tons of action to it or anything like that. It's really freaking good. And the ideas they throw around in there, I absolutely loved. Absolutely loved this movie. So, Presence, Presence. That's my recommendation for you this week. Now back to the show. All right, Josh, I have another thing here I quoted out of your book. OBEers may be called upon to interact with the dying. I don't think I knew this. In one heartbreaking incident, I've never read Monroe's stuff. Maybe that's why I didn't know some of this stuff. In one heartbreaking incident, Monroe left his body and reached the room of a bedridden 10 or 11-year-old boy, lonely and afraid and ill. He communicated comforting feelings to the child, promising to return. Several weeks later, Monroe met the now discarnate boy again. The boy was bewildered but not afraid and asked Monroe, "What do I do now? Where do I go?" At a loss, Monroe hugged the child, instructing him to wait for friends to arrive and provide further instructions. The next day, the newspaper carried the story of the death of a 10-year-old boy after a lingering illness, Monroe wrote. He had died in the afternoon shortly before I had begun the experiment. Monroe had unwittingly fulfilled a role described in a mythology worldwide. He had become a psychopomp.
See, so with that in mind, you might not have known that exact anecdote, but you definitely knew that OBEers might be called upon to visit the dying because, that's a shamanic thing, right? And that's one of the roles of shamans is to
that's true.
Is to perform the role of psychopomp. So you knew it on some level, and just as a preface, in case we do go down the shamanic pathway, the term shaman is region specific, it's culture specific, it's gotten applied broadly. We just don't have a lot of great terms for the role that these people play. And you can look across a lot of different cultures and see different individuals with culture-specific terms and traditions fulfilling similar roles and sort of having this semi-shamanic shape, as I would call it. So I use the term shaman as shorthand for a gifted individual who is attributed extraordinary abilities and acts as an intercessor between their community and the spirit world to do things like spirit retrieval, rectifying spiritual ailments, etc., often within the context of ecstatic experiences. That's a mouthful. So shaman is what you say. If you can get down to a specific culture in their specific term, that's what I tried to use in the book, and that's what I tried to use elsewhere. But like in just general discussion, the term shaman can apply to everything from babalawos to medicine men and medicine women and yoginis and saints and just a lot of different things. But that's sort of the way that I've started using the term.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have, because the actual regional terms from Russia, I believe.
Yeah, Eurasia, like that sort of Tungus Siberian sort of place, and a lot of the early shamanic scholars like Mircea Eliade applied it to Africa and Australia. Eliade was not great at treating those cultures in his work, and that's a whole other conversation we could have about Mircea Eliade. But yeah, it's just a general placeholder term because, like I said, the other version is a mouthful.
The problem is it's been a very misused term where people are just like, "Oh, I'm a shaman." It's like,
yeah, it's yeah. I mean, it's used so willy-nilly, and like when people tell me that they're a shaman and they're not from one of these, when they're from like a modern culture, I kind of have a tendency to be like, really? Are you really? Or did you pay $900 to do a week-long summit in Sedona?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the disclaimer. But psychopomp, I think, is the real takeaway here, right? I mean, that's a term that's all over these books and demanded its own chapter. And it's another one of those terms, much like you sort of knowing that but not realizing it. It's a term that you know but you don't realize, even if you've never read it before. Psychopomps are any figures that are charged with escorting human souls from here, not human souls from here to the afterlife. And these would be things like, on the cultural level, the Grim Reaper, religion-specific level, certain angels, certain deities like Anubis or Hermes, and then at a sort of at a more general level, even some animals across cultures. And earlier I'd spoken about how the bird had all these associations of being a death symbol, but birds are also another potent psychopomp animal. Birds, right, horses, and dogs, you see that everywhere human beings are. You see those three animals coming up time and time again. Probably one of those reasons, along with the association of devouring corpses, that Anubis has a jackal head is because of that assumption, that connection with dogs. But you'll see dogs as psychopomps in Egypt, and you'll find it in certain parts of South America. You'll find birds as psychopomps in, island Southeast Asia, and you'll find it in North America. Like these are really widespread themes. But with those animals, which are also, the animals that Mircea Eliade called shamanic animals par excellence, no coincidence there. They all embody attributes that you would want for an escort from this life into the next. Birds can go places that human beings cannot, including, between the upper and lower worlds. Horses can get you there faster.
Right.
And dogs are, loyal companions that can lead you. And there are other animals that are also psychopomps as well that you'll see. But a lot of times they do have these strong shamanic associations because among the duties that shamans would be charged with as fulfilling within their community, they were also, psychopomps. A member of the community would pass away. And depending on the culture, they might do a number of different things, but one of those things would be traveling astrally to sort of escort the soul of the dead to the afterlife. And again, there are an infinite amount of different variations on this, but that's the broadest strokes of some of those duties that would be fulfilled.
One of the other associations here I wasn't familiar with, which goes in the opposite direction. Well, actually, what did I write? What did I do here? A staggering number of psychopomps exist throughout religion and culture. We can comprehend, if not exhaustively, examine them in 5 categories: animals, humans, deities, folk figures, and natural phenomena. What's the natural phenomenon?
Yeah, you could have just said that and saved me a bunch of time. The most common natural phenomena ascribed psychopomp duties would be the sun and the moon.
Okay.
Because they are mainstays of the sky. Probably a bit too much to get into right now, but the underworld in a lot of cultures was the night sky below the ecliptic, below the passage that the sun takes. That was conceived as the underworld. The underworld can also be an upper world. It's kind of a counterintuitive thing. But the idea would be that in other contexts, these celestial bodies like the sun and the moon would go essentially to people on Earth. It would appear as if they're going below the ground, right?
Right.
You're taking that travel to the underworld and might take souls with them and then come back. And also they're encoding sort of a birth and death motif as well, because they are born and die every 24 hours. And I think it's really important there that there were identified flying objects in the form of the sun and the moon that were ascribed psychopomp traits, and we have unidentified objects that, as I talk about at length in book 2, kind of fit the bill for psychopomps. There's another psychopomp symbol that we all know, even if we don't know it intellectually, we know it on some other level, and that's the boat. And that it's a psychopomp symbol for the same reason that the horse is a psychopomp, right? It's a means of traveling to places that you cannot reach, which is why, a lot of island-based cultures, the afterlife, the undiscovered country, if you will, might lie beyond the horizon. There might be some sort of island or someplace. So the psychopomp's boat is a very, very common motif. Some shamans during their ecstatic trances would actually sit in a canoe and sort of, as a means of sort of metaphorically traveling to the afterlife. And what is the UFO? But like a variation on that theme, right? I would argue it's a vessel that comes from some other place to take you some other place. It's the exact same motifs and imagery. And that's an idea that Carl Jung introduced in passing in his Flying Saucer essay, the idea of the UFO as a psychopomp, but didn't really flesh it out. And so I was like, hey, how about we do that? And it wasn't as quick as I thought it would be. I mean, that was the real origins of Ecology of Souls, was going to be a quick little book about UFOs and death. And then the further I got, the more I was like, well, in order to understand this about UFOs and death, I have to reference these older traditions of, again, soul traditions, near-death experiences, fairies, altered states of consciousness. And it was like, I could digress every chapter while talking about UFOs, or I could put all that stuff into book 1 and talk about it. Yeah. And so, and refer people back to that once we get UFOs into the discussion.
One of the other things that I thought was interesting here was for various ancient cultures, bees symbolized immortality. I think I knew that. And ghosts might appear as swarms of bees, which I did not know. Bees were psychopomps in ancient Aegean belief. Their erratic flight patterns embodied wandering souls to Teutons. To Christians, their emergence after hibernation resembled resurrection. Honey is also a natural preservative, warding off the effects of decay. I did not know that ghosts might appear as swarms of bees.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what that end note is referencing. Let's see here. I can't say right off the top of my head. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the ways that we used to think about ghosts were, quite frankly, if we think about the sort of the Western tradition coming out of Greece and Rome and the classical literature, were quite different to the way that we think about ghosts today. Ghosts as being much more physical, and doing things like that. I think that what that really highlights, though, too, is the sort of buzzing that you hear in so many of these encounters.
Yeah.
And I get to that at some point. I can't remember if it's in book 1 or book 2, but buzzing is across. You see that across everything: altered states of consciousness, near-death experiences, the UFO stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
And the fact that bees just so happens to be a hive of bees as a psychopomp symbol. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. But what I did find was that the psychopomp animals that you find, and again, these are also culture specific because you just alluded to bees being psychopomps. Stags can be psychopomps. In certain cultures, something like, I mean, you would find, other beasts of burden being psychopomps. But some of the most common psychopomps, again, looking back to horses, birds, and dogs, these are UFO animals. I mean, if you were to make a list of animals associated with UFO sightings, it would probably be those three, by which I mean the first livestock mutilation was Snippy the horse. There's a movie on Netflix called Horse Girl that's about alien abductions. Really? Yeah. This is before I got sober, so I was drunk when I was watching it, but I remember it being pretty good. I think I'm pretty sure it was before I was sober. Anyway, obviously birds with, the owls and such.
Someone should write a book about that.
Someone should write a book about that. No, people should read the book about that. That's what the real problem is. More people to read Mike's work.
Yes.
And then dogs. I mean, I know that doesn't seem intuitive to anyone, but if you look back through the contactee literature, you have the stories of Big Bo, the Venusian dog that I can't remember one of the contactees wrote. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But you also have the Alan Godfrey case where he was taken aboard a craft and saw a large dog. Keel talks about like dogs congregating, coming from all around one neighborhood to descend upon a landing site that had happened earlier in the day. There's a weird undercurrent of dogs in a lot of UFO stories as well. And I think that there's something significant in that psychopomp animals are shamanic animals, and they're also UFO animals, quite frankly.
This next one you end with a question, so this will be my question.
Oh, one other thing.
Yeah.
One other thing. Horses specifically have this long-standing association with royalty and therefore with the sun. So once you've gotten this, large glowing disc in the sky associated with horses, I think that makes a case as well. Sorry, just thought I'd interject that.
All right, jerk.
Your question. You had a question.
No, I have a quote from your book that ends with a question. And you talked about this a little bit earlier, but I want to get a little more into it. A wide variety of mythic humanoids are diminutive. Apparently that word is hard. Worldwide fairy folklore and contemporary UFO reports, particularly post-1960, exemplify as much, from leprechauns and pixies dancing in the moonlight to hairy dwarves and gray aliens parked flying saucers. Short entities litter Fortiana. If the other world represents an ecology of souls, what do we make of this attribute?
Yeah, and this sort of, I'm going to invoke some book 2 material here, but I think there's something about the fact that the gray looks an awful lot like a human fetus too.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And, missing, abnormal pregnancies associated with abductees and whatnot. I think that this all sort of hints at something. And also the number of, I mean, who are we to assume that ghost children, as they're seen or leaving behind tiny footprints or tiny handprints, that they aren't part and parcel of this sort of ecology that I'm trying to outline as well? But yeah, it's kind of funny because fairies in the older traditions weren't always small, but they often were small. So they could, there were size shifters in addition to being shapeshifters. But it is that does seem to be part of the chain of custody for explaining why we associated fairies as being small, is because of this association with the dead, which oftentimes was conceptualized as being small. That again ties into the idea that, well, your soul has to be contained within your body. So maybe it's a little homunculus that comes out. But that's something that you see again in the old world and in certain parts of the new world and in parts of Asia as well.
And I have, and even when people see not necessarily UFO encounters, but like just weird creatures, a lot of times they're small. Like there was, what was it? It was Ghost Adventures, I think. And they had one of those machines that, it was like the Xbox thing that you can.
Right. Yep.
And they got like this small thing, and it's like, assuming they weren't just completely fabricating it, which is possible, but it didn't seem like they were. There were certain things about it that seemed completely legitimate, where the thing was like climbing him, and he's like, I feel cold right there. What the hell? What's going on? He's like, there's a thing climbing you, but all they could get was the small stick figure of it.
Yeah, and oddly enough, there are illusions. It's not entirely widespread, but there are illusions across NDEs sometimes of shrinking, oftentimes into a ball of light. But also in some pre-birth memories, which are sometimes presented as part of the NDE investigation, and sometimes are obtained through hypnotic regression. Either way, there are allusions to shrinking as well in those contexts. The human, I had a sense of myself becoming smaller. So I think that might speak to the origins of this belief as well.
Well, and it could be too. I mean, that sense of being smaller might be because we're disconnecting from our higher self to some degree. Well,
yeah, and you're also getting a sense of how expansive reality in the universe is too. Like, true. I'm not discounting that at all, but I'm just saying that that might have played a role in the origins of these beliefs.
What was the next one I had? I had one comment you made that I didn't like it. Have you ever noticed?
Okay.
Have you ever noticed it's how it seems like celebrities die in threes? Kind of depends. Kind of depends what you count as a celebrity and where you're counting from.
Oh, I know. I just thought it was a fun little aside.
I know.
Yeah, because like, how wide of a net am I going to cast? Is it going to be 3 within a week or 3 within a month?
Exactly. And what counts as like what level of celebrity?
But there is a threeness to the paranormal, right?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Which is, I would argue now with my current mindset, the same threeness that we see in fairy tales. But yeah, I mean, 3 a.m. is when all the ghosts come out, and oftentimes it's 3 humps on the Loch Ness Monster, triangular UFOs,
3 knocks.
Yeah, like 3 scratches are when you get a scratch from a daemon, it's 3 scratches on your back. Yeah.
Nice pronunciation there for demon.
Daemons.
You talk about Freud talking about well, I'll read the quote. Modern society rarely addresses polypsychism or multiple souls within us. Freud separated consciousness into id, superego, and ego. Jung proposed ego, personal unconsciousness, and, as mentioned, collective unconsciousness. Postulating aspects of the self could appear as the other. Ergo, we wonder whether paranormal entities are somehow projections of ourselves. But
go ahead.
And the thing is, like, I think that's a hard concept for people to understand until you consider, like, an average dream, not a big dream. An average dream is mostly coming probably from you, yet you're not creating it.
A little dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that this idea of polypsychism is really powerful, and I think that it probably, if integrated, could lead to a better understanding of ourselves. This idea that it's one person, one soul, maybe you've got a spirit, but that is not really how any of our traditions began. There was oftentimes this idea that there were multiple parts of ourselves, as I alluded to earlier, 7 or 9, in some Egyptian traditions. In some Norse cosmologies, 3 different aspects of the soul, but there was oftentimes at least, 2 parts of your soul. And we still talk this way today. Like, how many times have you been in a situation you're like, well, my head says this, but my heart says this.
Sure.
Or like, I know this is okay, but something in my gut doesn't feel right. Like, there's a sort of a two-ness to us, to sort of paraphrase Dr. Kreipel. But it also helps to explain how these things could come from us and yet also sort of have this exteriority to themselves, have this sort of autonomy to themselves. And indeed, this is probably where the doppelganger concept comes from. It isn't like somehow there's a miraculously constructed double of yourself. Oftentimes it was this idea that it was an aspect of yourself that was wandering freely on its own.
Right.
And that was the reason that it was always a death omen. It's not because like your doppelganger is necessarily evil. It's about the fact that the bonds that hold your body and soul together have weakened such that this part of yourself can go off and do whatever it wants to.
Right.
Yeah. And I can't remember if this is book 1 stuff or book 2 stuff. It all kind of blurs together because, as I said, I sort of intended it for it to be one book. But, Carl Jung suggested that the UFO might be a representation of the mandala, which would be a symbol of totality. And, you could even extrapolate that to the UFO being a soul. And it's very popular to think, oh, well, maybe they're disembodied souls. And I think there's a strong argument to be made for that in the context of, as we've alluded to earlier, the soul becoming a ball of light, the soul being a ball of light in a lot of traditions, both early church traditions and indigenous traditions and ancient traditions, light phenomena and the soul. There's something to that. And so what does that mean for the UFO question? Well, it could be souls of people wandering about in the sky, especially if they're just balls of light. There's an argument to be made for souls as being more technical, but I won't talk about that right now. We're technological. There's an argument that when we astrally travel, our souls might appear as balls of light. This is indicated in some indigenous traditions where they would say, I believe it was among Inuit communities at one point. An informant was told that you would see balls of light phenomena around the homes of either people who were dying or their shamanic figures who were astral traveling. So it's like, well, so it's the same thing. It's the soul being separated from the body. You're looking at souls, right? Yeah. So, and the fact that, you see UFOs at night and that your soul can wander during sleep seems significant. That's one of the reasons in a lot of cultures you're not supposed to shock people awake because, again, your soul might be out wandering, and that's why it might kill you if someone shocks you awake. There are a lot of prohibitions in a lot of different cultures about that. Huh. But if we do have this sort of wandering soul aspect to us, then maybe when you see a light in the sky, it's a part of yourself. Which would explain the sort of intimacy it has with you as an experiencer. It might explain, why it has your best interests or not, or why it's so interested in you, I guess, right? Yeah. Why it responds to your thought. It might be a part of you. And then you look at the fact that, like doppelgangers, balls of light are death omens. So this is all getting really internally consistent. Doppelgangers as a separated part of your soul, balls of light as souls, both being death omens. And there are indications that I get into in volume 2 of UFOs appearing around the time of death, especially if someone has had contact earlier in their life. UFO sightings might accompany them, might accompany their passing. So again, it starts to get a little almost too consistent for my own taste in some ways. And that's still leaving room for there being something else behind the UFO phenomenon. Again, sure. we can have a both and sort of answer here. But I grow more convinced that the balls of light are some sort of soul energy of some sort, whether that's some sort of Gaian energy soul or just general living plasma or our own souls. Right. I don't know, but I think that there's something to that,
or maybe all of the above.
Yeah, and there's probably something to be said about that. Universal interdiction to not follow the lights that probably would have something to do with this, the lights being death omens. It probably has something to do with that. But yeah, and these things are all answered kind of by polypsychism. They're all accounted for in a polypsychic approach to what it means to be human.
And I'd also want to point out that, when you look at poltergeist cases, at least some of them seem to be generated fully by the person, like the subjects who's generating the psi energy, and they're not doing it consciously.
Right.
There may be cases where a spirit takes over, uses that energy, but there are certainly cases that seem to be 100% a person projecting this, but they're not doing it consciously. They have no control over that.
And again, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and to give people a better idea of what I'm talking about, I would say that is imaginal as well. That is a manifestation of the imaginal, the idea that it comes from the percipient. You might be able to interchange imaginal with psychic, although I think imaginal probably has a little bit more agency in terms of allowing the imagination to play a role.
All right. That seems like a good place to stop. Tell people where they can find you, Josh.
You can find me at Where Did the Road Go?
Yeah, you've been on more than twice.
Yeah, I've been on more than twice. I hope. Every time I'm on here, I say I hope to be on more.
Well, you were just on a couple months ago.
Well, it's not as often as I'd like, but okay. But you can find me here. You can find me at joshuacutchin.com, which is my website. That's JOSHUACUTCHIN.com. I have a couple of appearances, although they're a bit on down the line. One of them is, they're both in August. One of them is August 2nd, 2025 at Paracon, Kansas City. That website is paraconkc.com. And the other is also in Missouri. It's going to be a very Missouri August for me. I'll be at the Cape Girardeau Paranormal Convention, which is the last weekend in August. And I will be there with Mr. Micah Hanks and probably some other people familiar to the Where Did the Road Go audience.
Nice.
Fourth Wall Phantoms is coming out April 13th. You heard it here first, folks. And that's all about the interplay between the paranormal and our fictions that we have, and really sort of unpacking some of those ideas. And if you've enjoyed my stranger, more philosophical ramblings tonight, there's plenty of that in that book, but also some just fun stories. I mean, just fun stories. There's a couple of unpublished stories in there that have never been obviously seen anywhere else. A couple of rare stories, and they're just absolutely wild. And it really does stem from that sort of impulse that I alluded to earlier of like, well, these stories are out there. What do you do with them, Josh? What do you do with them? I don't want to think that fictions can come to life, but if they do, then how do we make that happen? And what does that have to say about the paranormal as a whole? So that's what that book is about. So if you want to watch my social media spaces for more on that, you can go to facebook.com /Joshua Cutchin author. And you can go to my Instagram, which my wife set up, and I can't remember my handle, but if you search for me, you'll find me. And we're currently in the midst, maybe not when this comes out, but we're currently in the midst of counting down chapter by chapter until we reach the date for the cover reveal and the trailer for the book. The cover is done by Where Did the Road Go family member Matt Festa, and he's done a fantastic job. I'm absolutely in love with it. So can't wait to share that with folks. And that's my very long coda on this edition of Where Did the Road Go.
All right. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Soraya.
I want to take a moment here to thank all of my Patreons. I can't do this without you, so thank you for supporting the show. And know that every positive thing that comes out of this show is partially because of you. I want to give a special shout out to all my patrons who are pledging $10 or more a month. Greg Ross, John Blackburn, Madeline J., Marty Garza, Matt in Delaware, Allison Cook, Super Inframan, 36 Dingo, Tim, Andrew Nichols, Matthew Sproul, Marthartha, Midnight Review Presents, Christine, a blue second-gen MR2 drifting around a Japanese mountain, Abby Allen, Cherry Trapezoid, Patricia Gayaquinta, American Rambler, Andrew Maines, Ann Witowski, Barbara Fisher, Beverly Williamson, Billuminati, Bright Rectangle, Charles Davis, Charles in Florida, Land of the Crazy and Communicable, Corey Nelson, Diane B., MTK, Eric Citron, Eric Todd, History and Coffee, J. Otto Bullitt, Jack Huntington, James Lindsay, Jim and Sophie, John Mattingly, John Bracken, Jonathan Frost, Carla Mahoney, Kevin Shurek, Cool Kitty, Kristen L., Laser Printer Jam, Lauren McLean, Linda from Michigan, Linz Jackson K., MJ Armstrong, Mark Shoemaker, Mark Brady, Mark Smith, Paul Jeffries, Perry Peters, Philosopher of Mirrors, Riker and Stark, Ron Dupre, Sam Sharon, Sasha McHale, Schmooples, Devourer of Mortal Souls, Stacy Sherwood, Tactical Therapist, Taylor Bell, Thunderboy, Tyler Glimstead, Victoria, Vincent Treewell, Will Cherry, Will Gebhard, Will Powell, Annabelle Smith, Caroline Walker, TDT Skunkworks, Colin Karras, Craig Sagastumi, and Matthew Brown. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. There is a Patreon-only segment to go along with this show. If you want to become a patron, just go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the Patreon link and sign up there. You can also get the shows extra on iTunes. They're available there. If you're listening there, you can just pay for a show. You can also just pay for an extra show on Patreon, too. If you don't want to subscribe and you just want a particular extra piece of content, I make most of it available as a one-time payment thing. You can also check out the documentary there. Again, one-time payment, and you can watch the documentary that Chris Ernst made about myself and Where Did the Road Go? I'll see you next time. You have been listening to Where Did the Road Go? This show is made possible in part from our Patreons, and we thank you and everyone listening for helping us continue this exploration of the strange. You can always find everything Where Did the Road Go related at www.wheredidtheroadgo.com. And thank you so much for your support.